Shalom. Welcome to lesson number 1 of Secrets of the Forgotten Prophetic Scriptures 101. I'm your instructor, Alexander Lawrence. I'm glad you're here with me, and it's a pleasure to have you. By now, you've gone through the introduction to this course, and you know what you're getting yourself into. So let me just say, I'm proud of you. Proud of you for deciding to go beyond tradition in search of truth. Just so you know, my firm commitment is to find neglected truths, not invent new interpretations just because they're fresh or titillating. I hope you're going to make that commitment with me at the start of our journey together. This lesson is going to cover chapters 1 through 9. If you haven't read those chapters yet, please pause the video and go familiarize yourself with them before you continue. We're going to begin by charging headfirst through the wall of academic consensus. 2nd Baruch begins, as many scrolls do, with a statement establishing the date of composition. In this case, Baruch claims that the word of the Lord came to him in the 25th year of Jeconiah, king of Judah. This information, presented as fact by the scroll's author, is used as ammunition to disqualify 2nd Baruch, because critics say that the 25th year of Jeconiah did not coincide with the fall of Jerusalem. Therefore, 2nd Baruch must be fiction, written by someone claiming to be Baruch. During the introduction to this class, I told you that I was going to disarm the critics who use chapter 1, verse 1 to try and disqualify 2nd Baruch as inspired scripture. Most of this first lesson is going to be dedicated to doing just that. I'm going to be throwing, by the way, a lot of names and dates at you, so make sure that you use the supporting information in the participant's guide to help you keep pace. Now, I know some of you will groan inwardly when you hear that we're going to be dealing with lots of dates and names, because most people aren't particularly thrilled to receive history lessons. But it really is necessary for us to learn some historical facts if we're going to defend 2nd Baruch. And at the same time, we'll come to a much better understanding of the book of Jeremiah, and even parts of 2nd Chronicles and 2nd Kings. Plus, let me put your mind at ease a little bit by letting you know that what we're going to be covering here is a riveting period of Near Eastern history. Very dramatic and world-changing stuff. So it's a bit like Game of Thrones, but real, and without all the sex. By the way, I'm not endorsing Game of Thrones. Don't watch it. As we piece together a timeline of events from the death of King Josiah to the Jewish migration into Egypt, understand that the dates I'll be providing are subject to change. The chronology is by no means firmly settled among scholars. One of the main chronological anchors used by scholars is the Battle of Carchemish. The year 605 is the most commonly accepted date for the Battle of Carchemish and for King Nebuchadnezzar's accession, but it isn't without detractors. By the way, accession means his rise to the throne. So, due to the possibility that scholars could change their minds about the exact years of major historical events, I'm going to place less emphasis on getting the years right, and more emphasis on establishing the correct sequence of events and intervals of time between those events. But first, before we begin discussing all of that, let's talk about the author. Baruch, son of Neriah, was a Judean born during the 7th century before Christ. According to Jewish historian Josephus, his father was chamberlain to King Zedekiah. Baruch himself entered the service of the prophet Jeremiah as his scribe, and we find Baruch mentioned in the third person several times throughout the book of Jeremiah. Let's take a look at just one instance. Jeremiah 45, 1-5 reads, "The message that Jeremiah the prophet spoke to Baruch the son of Neriah, when he wrote these words in a book at the mouth of Jeremiah, in the 4th year of Jehoiakim the son of Josiah, king of Judah, saying, Yahweh, the God of Israel, says to you, Baruch, you said, Woe is me now, for Yahweh has added sorrow to my pain. I am weary with groaning, and I find no rest. You shall tell him, Yahweh says, Behold, that which I have built, I will break down, and that which I have planted, I will pluck up, and this is the whole land. Do you seek great things for yourself? Don't seek them, for behold, I will bring evil on all flesh, says Yahweh. But I will let you escape with your life wherever you go." This is fascinating. As Baruch was scribing for Jeremiah, Elohim had the older prophet respond to something that Baruch had prayed. I imagine that he had prayed this while grieving in private, but Yahweh was addressing the lament publicly for the sake of us all. If I may paraphrase his answer, Yahweh says, "It's my prerogative to devastate the land of Judah, because I'm both the landowner and the developer. I am just to bring judgment. Don't waste your time trying to set up a nice future for yourself here. Bad times are going to come upon every living thing in Judah, but because you are a righteous man, your life will be spared." This must have been a very humbling moment for Baruch, but at the same time encouraging, because his safety was assured. So we see that the Bible attests to Baruch as a historical personage, as someone who was working with a renowned prophet, and we see that Elohim held Baruch in high regard. It shouldn't be a surprise to us to learn that Baruch had written his own scrolls apart from his scribal work for Jeremiah. The scribe became a great prophet in his own right during the years surrounding the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. The Apocalypse of Baruch is certainly the lesser known of the prophet's writings. The book of 1st Baruch was included in the Septuagint translation of the Bible, which is the Greek version that was popular at the time of Yeshua's first advent. 1st Baruch is a fairly short scroll of confession of sins and petition for mercy, but it contains some crucial tidbits. We'll be referencing parts of 1st Baruch here and there throughout this course. And we're soon going to see from the content of that book that the prophet Baruch went to Babylon for a short while, then returned to Jerusalem. Before we move on, I'd like to familiarize you with some terms that you're going to see repeatedly as we move through the Apocalypse of Baruch. Chaldea. Chaldeans are people from southern Mesopotamia, where Babylon was located. Abraham grew up in Ur of the Chaldees. Chaldea is synonymous with southern Mesopotamia, the seat of Babel. Israel. Israel means he wrestles with Elohim. This name is used in chapter 3, verse 5, "For if you destroy your city and deliver up your land to those that hate us, how shall the name of Israel be again remembered?" This term is a complicated one. It's most often used scripturally to refer to Yahweh's covenant people, whether ethnically Hebrew or not. But on some occasions, it is used in two other ways. Number one, in reference to the northern kingdom of 9.5 tribes that split from the other tribes during the reign of Solomon's son. This kingdom was also called Ephraim. Number two, in reference to the Hebrew descendants of the northern kingdom even after they were exiled and scattered around the world. The only way to determine which meaning is intended is to use context clues. The Apostle Paul taught in his letter to the Romans that a person of Gentile lineage who comes to faith in Messiah is grafted into Israel. Or, as he put it in his letter to the Ephesians, the Gentiles can gain citizenship in the commonwealth of Israel through betrothal to Messiah. Now, Yeshua was from Judah, not Israel, so betrothal to him should technically mean joining the southern kingdom of Judah, not the northern kingdom of Israel. Except what Yeshua did by dying and making a new covenant in his blood was to reconcile the southern and northern kingdoms in a legal sense. Since the crucifixion, anyone who wants to be a part of Yahweh's kingdom must enter into covenant with Yeshua, meaning that we are all one family, and there is no longer any division between tribes. The tribes do still exist as designations, but they are all once again united as Israel. This has yet to play out entirely on the world stage, with scattered believers returning to the land to dwell together as a united kingdom, but in a spiritual and legal sense, the reunification has already occurred. Judah. Now that we understand Israel, let's talk about the southern kingdom of Judah specifically. Years before Baruch wrote any scrolls, Yahweh had divorced the northern kingdom of Israel, also known as Ephraim, and had allowed the Assyrians to swoop in and almost entirely remove the northern tribes. The southern two tribes, collectively referred to as Judah, were not divorced, even though they deserved to be put away for their unfaithfulness. Yahweh had made a covenant with King David, assuring him that he would always have a descendant upon the throne, so it wasn't possible for Yahweh to divorce Judah. Instead, he punished them severely by using the Babylonians to oppress and enslave them. The exile to Babylon only lasted 70 years, though, and then Judah was allowed to return to the land. This set the stage for Messiah to arrive a few hundred years later. Mother. In chapter 3, verses 1 through 3, Baruch bemoans the fact that he must witness his mother come to ruin. It would be natural to take this at face value and imagine that Baruch was talking about his biological mother, but he's actually talking about Jerusalem. We see this clearly in 1 Baruch 4, 8 through 16, which reads, "Ye have grieved Jerusalem that nursed you. For when she saw the wrath of Elohim coming upon you, she said, Hearken, O ye that dwell about Zion. Elohim has brought upon me great mourning, for I saw the captivity of my sons and daughters, which the everlasting brought upon them. With joy did I nourish them, but sent them away with weeping and mourning. Let no man rejoice over me, a widow, and forsaken of many, who for the sins of my children are left desolate, because they departed from the Torah of Elohim." Mother was a very natural term for a Jew to apply to Jerusalem. We find correlating expressions in Isaiah 49, 14 and 21, Matthew 23, 37, and Galatians 4, 26. Zion. The name Zion is synonymous with the city of Jerusalem, even though Zion is technically only one area of Jerusalem. Zion was the mountain on which David built his palace, and since that place is the seat of authority over the nation, the name of Mount Zion represents the capital city as a whole. That's all the terminology that we need for right now. Let's start to construct a timeline so that we understand where Baruch fits in. Josiah was Judah's last godly king before everything went to hell in a handbasket. His righteous efforts at national reform stalled the moral degeneration of the kingdom and brought some blessings back to Judah. But Josiah wasn't perfect, and his life and career ended prematurely because he became overzealous and ignored a warning from the prophet Jeremiah. During the reign of Josiah, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was taking over Assyria, which at that point ruled most of the Near East. The Egyptians, under the leadership of Pharaoh Necho, wanted to pass peacefully through Israel on their way to aid the Assyrians against the Babylonians, but Josiah refused their request and attacked them at the valley of Megiddo. The Judeans were soundly defeated, and Josiah was struck with an arrow during the battle. Best I can tell, he died from his injury in 608 BC, probably in March or April. Josiah's son, Jehoahaz, took the throne and ruled for all of 3 months before Pharaoh Necho dethroned him and replaced him with one of his brothers, Eliakim, who would function as a viceroy of Egypt. Pharaoh Necho renamed the new king of Judah from Eliakim to Jehoiakim. Remember the name Jehoiakim because he's a key player. This son of Josiah was not God-fearing like his father. 2 Kings 23:37 tells us that Jehoiakim did evil in the sight of Yahweh. Jehoiakim had a couple of sons who we need to know about. 1 Chronicles 3:16 lists them as Jeconiah and Zedekiah. Let me save those of you who study this out for yourselves some frustration by letting you know that this Zedekiah is not the Zedekiah that will be enthroned in 597 BC. The Zedekiah who becomes king is actually the brother of Jehoiakim, and thus the uncle of the other Zedekiah, son of Jehoiakim. And to complicate matters further, Jeconiah, also known as Coniah, used the throne name Jehoiakim. Keen, not Keem like his father, but very similar and easy to get mixed up. So Jeconiah is the same as Jehoiakim. The first time that Jerusalem came under siege by Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon was during the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's kingship, according to Daniel 1:1-2, which we'll read now. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, and he carried them into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. He brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Notice that only part of the temple implements were deported at this time. The parallel passage to this is 2 Chronicles 36, 6-7, which reads, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against Jehoiakim, and bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried some of the vessels of Yahweh's house to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. If Jehoiakim became king of Judah in the middle of 608 BC, then the first assault on Jerusalem occurred sometime after the spring of 606 BC and before the summer of 605 BC, in order for it to fall within the third year of Jehoiakim's reign. Remember, with dates after Christ, you count up as you go forward in history, but with dates before Christ, you count down to go forward in history. I'm going to suggest that the siege began at some point between April and July, late during Jehoiakim's third year. We can't be sure of how long Jerusalem was under siege, but it didn't last too terribly long before the Babylonians prevailed. Maybe Jehoiakim got intimidated and surrendered easily. Whatever the case, the Bible tells us that Jehoiakim was put in chains to be taken to Babylon, but something unexplained happened, and he was allowed to remain as king of Judah. According to 2 Kings 23:36, he ruled for 11 years in total, but at the time of the siege he had only ruled for 3 years. The Bible doesn't describe Nebuchadnezzar's motives for letting Jehoiakim stay in power, but a Babylonian historical record might. There exists a cuneiform tablet, part of a series of tablets called the Babylonian Chronicles, that details the military and political events of circa 605 to 594 BC, the time period during which King Nebuchadnezzar II campaigned in the west and captured Jerusalem. The tablet was excavated by Robert Coldaway at the turn of the 20th century. It's currently located in the British Museum in London. The tablet begins, in the 21st year, which would be 605 and 604 BC. The king of Akkad stayed in his own land while Nebuchadnezzar, his eldest son, the crown prince, mustered the Babylonian army and took command of his troops. He marched to Carchemish, which is on the bank of the Euphrates. Nebuchadnezzar's dad was still alive when the prince began his military campaign in the west to solidify Babylonian dominance throughout the region. The Babylonian Chronicles goes on to inform us that Nebuchadnezzar's father died on the 15th of August, 605 BC, and that the Battle of Carchemish had already happened before that point. After Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar was busy conquering the whole area of Hamath. The Chronicles, the Bible, and the Jewish historian Josephus are in agreement that the Babylonians came against Egypt at the city of Carchemish and utterly annihilated them. Some historians say that this battle occurred in 606 BC, but that isn't possible because Jeremiah 46:2 states that the battle occurred during the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign, which puts the event after the first siege of Jerusalem, which, if you'll recall, happened during the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign. So the Battle of Carchemish most likely happened sometime during the siege of Jerusalem, which is quite possible because Nebuchadnezzar didn't need to be personally present in order for the siege to continue. I think he left Jerusalem to take care of business at Carchemish, then returned to Jerusalem in September 605 BC, which was during the early part of Jehoiakim's 4th year. I think that's when Jehoiakim, hearing how thoroughly the Egyptians had been slaughtered, decided to wave the white flag. Nebuchadnezzar then got word that his father had died, and he had to leave in haste before he had time to fully assess the situation and assert his authority in Jerusalem. So he decided to leave Jehoiakim as his vassal in exchange for an oath of subservience and a heavy tribute. As Nebuchadnezzar left, he took with him some choice prisoners, including the prophet Daniel. After Carchemish and Jerusalem were dealt with, nothing much stood in the way of Babylon claiming all the land between the Euphrates and the Nile. That's why the Babylonian Chronicles states, in the accession year, late 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar went back again to the Hatti land. Let me pause there. The Hatti land is the area stretching from Asia Minor all the way down to southern Israel, according to the Babylonians. Back to the quote. And until the month of Sabatu, marched unopposed through the Hatti land. In the month of Sabatu, early 604 BC, he took the heavy tribute of the Hatti territory to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar wasted no time, but turned around and went right back to his western campaign after his coronation. Now this is where the drama really begins. Egypt made a resurgence in the last years of the 7th century, and Jehoiakim got uppity. Jeremiah warned Jehoiakim not to be defiant, but the king would not listen, and he burned the scroll that Jeremiah had written. In mid-602 BC, Pharaoh Necho reclaimed Gaza from the Babylonians, as we see in Jeremiah 47:1. And Jehoiakim, throwing in his lot with the Egyptians, took the opportunity to rebel against Lord Nebuchadnezzar. See 2 Kings 24:1. It took some time, but Nebuchadnezzar eventually responded to that insubordination by deploying Babylonian, Aramean, Moabite, and Ammonite forces against Judah. For over a year, these mercenaries terrorized the Judean countryside, razed several cities, and carted off numerous prisoners, causing many Judeans to flee to Jerusalem for safety. Nonetheless, Jehoiakim did not relent. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar decided to personally lead another attack on Jerusalem. The Chronicles say that this was during the 7th year, which would be from September 598 to September 597 BC. 2 Kings 24:2 says that it was during the 8th year of kingship, but that discrepancy is because the Babylonians and the Hebrews started counting years of kingship at different times. The Hebrews considered a king's first year as beginning immediately after the coronation, but the Babylonians didn't mark the first year until the first day of the new civil year following the king's accession. That's a little complicated. Let me say it again. The year in which a king came to the throne was not the first year according to the Babylonian way of tracking time. That was called the accession year. It wasn't until they reached the Babylonian New Year after the accession that they started counting it as the first year of the king's reign. So there really isn't a discrepancy between the Babylonian record and 2 Kings 24:2. The two sources do agree. So Nebuchadnezzar gathered his army and moved out for Jerusalem at the tail end of 598 BC. Justice caught up with Jehoiakim right about the time that Nebuchadnezzar was departing from Babylon. He died, mysteriously. Unfortunately, no record remains to describe how he died, but my bet is on pro-Babylonian forces within Jerusalem. Jehoiakim's body was unceremoniously dumped outside of the city, just as Jeremiah had prophesied. See Jeremiah 22:18-19 and 36:29-30. Jeconiah, son of Jehoiakim, took his father's place. As I told you earlier, the throne name of Jeconiah was Jehoiakim. According to 2 Chronicles 36:9, Jehoiakim became a co-regent in his 8th year of life, but he was not elevated to the position of primary regency until his 18th year of life. Most of you are probably saying, why does it matter? These numbers are boring. But we actually need to know how old Jehoiakim was when he took the throne, and you'll see why in a minute. Nebuchadnezzar brought his forces to bear on Jerusalem in February or March of 597 BC. This was during Nebuchadnezzar's 8th regal year, according to 2 Kings 24:2, which would have been his 7th year by Babylonian reckoning, and the 7th year is exactly what the Babylonian Chronicles report. Isn't it wonderful how the secular source confirms the Bible? It really is wise to trust the Hebrew Scriptures. According to 2 Kings 24:8, Jehoiakim had only reigned for 3 months when the Babylonians showed up. He didn't put up much of a fight before surrendering. Let's read what happened. And Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, went out to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his princes and his officers. And the king of Babylon captured him in the 8th year of his reign. He carried out from there all the treasures of Yahweh's house, and the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold, which Solomon king of Israel had made in Yahweh's temple, as Yahweh had said. He carried away all Jerusalem, and all the princes, and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. No one remained except the poorest of the land. He carried away Jehoiakim to Babylon, with the king's mother, the king's wives, his officers, and the chief men of the land. He carried them into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. 2 Kings 24:12-15. Along with Jehoiakim and his entourage, Nebuchadnezzar took many Jews as prisoners to Babylon. Before he left, he handpicked Mattaniah, brother of Jehoiakim, to be his vassal. He renamed him Zedekiah and placed him upon the throne of Judah in August of 597 BC. So what we see here is that the second sacking of Jerusalem was far worse than the first. It wasn't total destruction, but there was significant punishment from Babylon. Most of the powerful and influential people were taken to Babylon. According to the book of Esther, Mordecai was one of them that was taken at this point. You would think that the Judeans would have gotten the picture by now, and that they would simply submit quietly under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, but this was not the case. We'll get to that in a second. 4 years into the reign of King Zedekiah, when he journeyed to Babylon to present himself before Nebuchadnezzar, he was accompanied by his chief quartermaster, Seraiah. Baruch was Seraiah's brother, and they both went with Zedekiah to Babylon. Jeremiah gave Seraiah a scroll to take with him. The quartermaster was instructed to read Jeremiah's message to Jeconiah and the other prisoners of war, then tie the letter to a stone and toss it into the Euphrates River. See Jeremiah 51, 59 through 64. Something ill may have befallen Seraiah during the trip, because it ended up being Baruch who read the letter to the captive Jews, which he did on the 5th anniversary of the partial destruction of Jerusalem. Their response constitutes the entire book of 1st Baruch. In addition to writing a scroll to be taken back to the people of Jerusalem, the captives in Babylon also took up an offering to send to the high priest so that normal operations could be resumed on the Temple Mount. Because remember, only the poorest people were left in Jerusalem. Surprisingly, even though he was an evil king, Zedekiah did order the recreation of the sacred vessels needed for the operation of the temple. However, they were made of silver, not gold. These silver vessels may have been bought from Babylonian craftsmen who copied from the gold versions taken by Nebuchadnezzar, or they may have been gifted to Zedekiah by Nebuchadnezzar as a token of appreciation for his servitude. If the latter was true, it was a token given too soon, because Zedekiah rebelled almost immediately upon returning to Jerusalem. He'd had enough of living under the thumb of a dirty goy. In 592 BC, Zedekiah sent ambassadors to Egypt seeking help and armaments with which to resist Nebuchadnezzar. See Ezekiel 18:15 and compare it to 8:1 and 20:1. King Nebuchadnezzar wasn't going to take that lying down. He rose up against Judah once again. The final siege of Jerusalem began in December 590 or January 589 BC. Unlike his predecessors, Zedekiah did not quickly give up. He persistently resisted the attackers, so they persistently cut off all resources from entering the city. The siege lasted for about 30 months, with only a short break during which the Babylonians had to battle an approaching Egyptian army. During the siege, conditions within Jerusalem grew dire. The famine was eventually so bad that people became cannibals, even eating their own babies. See Lamentations 2:20 and 4:10, Deuteronomy 28:53 through 57, and Jeremiah 19:9. Most, but not all, scholarly sources will say that Jerusalem fell in 587 BC. I respectfully disagree. It's off by a year. Jeremiah, 2 Kings, and 2 Chronicles all say that Zedekiah reigned for 11 years in Jerusalem before being taken to Babylon. We established earlier that Nebuchadnezzar placed Zedekiah, previously known as Mattaniah, on the throne in the summer of 597 BC. 11 years from then brings us to the summer of 586. The wall was breached, Zedekiah was captured and blinded, and the king's sons were all slaughtered in front of him. All of this tragedy was the result of Yahweh's people stubbornly clinging to their sinful lifestyles. Let's read what Yahweh has to say about it. Have you seen all that this people are doing to me? That the evils which these 2 tribes which have remained have done are greater than those of the 10 tribes which were carried away captive? For the former tribes were forced by their kings to commit sin, but these 2 of themselves have been forcing and compelling their kings to commit sin. 2 Baruch chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. Isn't this the same situation that we Americans and other Westerners find ourselves in today? Unfortunately, our judges and politicians are under increasing pressure every day to champion all kinds of perversions and injustices. I'm afraid that if we don't turn this ship around, our collective end will be the same as that of the Judeans. Finally, we've come to the point where we can address 2 Baruch chapter 1, verse 1. It reads, And it came to pass in the 25th year of Jeconiah king of Judah, that the word of Yahweh came to Baruch son of Neriah. Notice what this doesn't say. It doesn't say the 25th year of the reign of Jeconiah. That would be highly erroneous because Jeconiah only reigned as king for 3 months and as co-regent for 10 years. No, this is talking about the 25th year of his life. Why does Baruch use Jeconiah/Jehoiakim instead of Zedekiah to tell us the time? I can't say for sure, but I suspect it's twofold. Number one, Zedekiah was an evil king who kicked against the goad. Jehoiakim was not even a man yet when he got to the throne at 17 years old. That is his 18th year of life, according to the Hebrew reckoning, but the 20th year of life is the biblical demarcation for adulthood. Jehoiakim submitted under the blows of Babylon that Yahweh allowed, whereas Zedekiah continually resisted discipline. Number two, Baruch had been with Jehoiakim in Babylon and had seen how he wept and fasted with the other captives when the message from Jeremiah was read. Jehoiakim seemed to have a heart that was responding to discipline. Whatever the case, we see that Yahweh's pronouncement of final and utter destruction upon Babylon was given to Baruch during Jehoiakim's 25th year of life, which was about 590 BC. That's when Yahweh told Baruch that he and the other holy men needed to leave Jerusalem, and they did so. They went and wept together in the valley of Kidron. Now look at chapter 6, verse 1 of 2 Baruch. It says that on the morning after they went to Kidron, the Chaldeans, that is, the Babylonians, surrounded Jerusalem. As Baruch is watching this happen, he's raised up in the spirit and given a vision of angels taking and hiding temple furniture, including the Ark of the Covenant. He then sees the angels break the foundations of the wall of Jerusalem at its corners, giving access to the invading army. Seeing their opening, the Chaldeans rush in and take the city. Now here's where most interpreters go wrong. They assume that this vision which Baruch received during the 25th year of Jehoiakim immediately preceded the capture of the city, because the narrative makes it seem that way. This presents a big problem because we know that the city didn't fall until 586 BC. So is the book of 2 Baruch wrong? Is it all a lie? Sometimes in the Bible, the narrative will skip a chunk of time without making it abundantly clear that a chronological leap is occurring. It happens a lot in prophecies, but we find the phenomenon in historical sections as well. 2 Baruch has just such a time skip in chapter 8. Verse 2 completes the vision that Baruch had. Now look at verses 3 and 4. And I, Baruch, departed, and it came to pass after these things that the army of the Chaldeans entered and seized the house and all that was around it. There it is, right there. Baruch's vision was a prophetic one. He wasn't seeing the angels breaking the foundations of the walls at that very moment. Rather, he was being shown what would happen 30 months later. The phrase, "it came to pass after these things," fast forwards the narrative more than 2 years, taking us to 586 BC. Do you see now that this book of Baruch's has been too quickly dismissed? He wasn't presenting us with a false account of history. We simply weren't interpreting it properly. As we proceed with our study of 2 Baruch, keep in mind that you may find a couple of things that seem out of sync with the other scriptures. If this happens, the most likely scenario is that part of our doctrine is a little bit askew and needs to be revisited to incorporate the new information. But the other possibility is that the English translation is just a bit off. The present English translation of 2 Baruch is translated from Syriac, which was translated from Greek, which was in turn translated from the Hebrew original. With each translation, the original work was increasingly shorn of its ancient vigor. Translators have aimed to give a literal reproduction of each source text, but that approach doesn't always capture the idioms and subtleties that were imbued by the author. In some instances, the true meaning of a verse may have been entirely lost in translation. We shouldn't assume that every verse in the English version correctly transmits the author's intentions. There are only a few surviving Greek fragments of 2 Baruch, so that's not of much use to us, which means, unfortunately, that we have no way of comparing manuscripts to help us when we need to interpret difficult passages. Nevertheless, I think you'll find as we study that the book more than earns itself the benefit of the doubt, because the vast majority of the content does corroborate the Bible.